It is finally time to address Disney Star Wars, um, which is almost the end of my quote unquote brief arc where I talk about what Star Wars is and what it is to me and what I think about it. And I'm going to talk about not only the sequel trilogy, but I'm also going to interweave the two standalone Star Wars stories, Rogue One and Solo, in there. Not because they're important from the development of the narrative arc of the sequel trilogy, but they are important for the development of the arc of the fandom menace and how it kind of came to be. Now, keep in mind, let me just summarize really quickly. I'm a huge fan of the original trilogy. I have been since I was a little kid. The first Star Wars movie is literally the first movie I remember seeing in theaters. I was 5.5 when it came out. For over 20 years, I would say that The Empire Strikes Back was my favorite movie. Maybe over 30 years. Not really sure exactly where that kind of changed. I'm a huge fan of the original trilogy. I'm not a purist of it, and I realize that it has its flaws, and in retrospect, some of its flaws are more evident, especially starting, ironically, in The Empire Strikes Back, continuing into Return of the Jedi, but not metastasizing until later. The prequel trilogy, I think, are movies that have a lot of potential that is mostly untapped because of flawed execution, and also probably just the fact that it wasn't really the best concept in the first place to try and do prequels where we already kind of knew the end of the story. Let's go back and tell the beginning of it. It's just not great narrative exposition to do that. So it was probably not the best idea in the first place, and it was just flawed by the fact that the movies are just very poorly made. The scripts are not good, the dialogue is not good, the pacing is not good, the chemistry between the characters for various reasons, and I don't know that I necessarily blame the actors for this, but it's not good. They're not very likable. They don't seem to act like normal people. Stuff happens that doesn't seem to make any sense why it would happen that way, and people do things that doesn't make sense why they would do them. So it's kind of tough, I guess, to enjoy them, but at the same time, the potential inherent in there is hard to ignore, and you can just see how, if it had one more pass with an advisor or two on the story structure, and then let somebody else really kind of polish up the screenplays, and maybe given it to another director who is a little more willing to kind of have some real kick and some better pacing, better editing. You can see how there's good movies in there trying to get out. So I don't hate the prequels, I just don't like them. And I think, though, however, that they are in some ways rehabilitated because that era is also where the Clone Wars series was set, and the Clone Wars was really quite good. It's not perfect either, but it's quite good. So, when the sequel trilogy started, I was hopeful, but I had been burned in the past, so I was a little more prepared for what happened. And the truth of the matter is, of course, that The Force Awakens was not a great movie either, although it also wasn't a terrible movie. But it wasn't great, and I could see immediately where they were going to go wrong. The reason that it's not terrible is, of course, the plot is stolen almost completely from the first movie, Star Wars, which was later retitled Episode 4, A New Hope, but it was just called Star Wars when it was released. And the plot is almost exactly the same. And the characters were much less compelling. Rey was an obvious Mary Sue from the very beginning, who just had to be good at everything just because she couldn't earn anything, because that would imply that she wasn't already the greatest thing ever before anything even started. And I mean, I could just tell right away that she was not going to be a compelling character. And I can't really blame Daisy Ridley for that, although I don't know that her performance was necessarily anything special. But you know, what are you going to do when you got terrible material like that to work with? Finn was kind of obviously reduced to comic relief kind of from the get-go, even though he had kind of an intriguing potential story that was never really told. Poe, kind of the same thing. He kind of had to become that. This didn't really happen in The Force Awakens, but he eventually became just nothing more than kind of the mansplainer who needed to exist in order for some woman to tell him how he's wrong. And it was also obvious that there was an agenda underwriting all of this. One of the things that I think most people enjoy about Star Wars is that there's no agenda, and the cultural context behind it just fades into the background. Part of this is because Star Wars was made in an era when the American culture was much more homogenous. We hadn't yet been flooded by tons of immigrants. We hadn't yet undergone propagandization for globalism. And so Star Wars was an American movie made in the American movie system for an American audience by American filmmakers and starring American actors. And it didn't necessarily mean that it didn't have global success, because obviously it did. It was very popular everywhere, but it was especially popular in America, especially popular with white men, or white boys and men, I should say, because it was exactly the type of story that had always appealed to them, and it was told in their native cultural context. It was clear, and this is true for almost everything Hollywood puts out. It wasn't quite as blatant in this as it was in something like, Ghostbusters 2016 or Terminator Dark Fate or something weird like that. But it was still clear, even in The Force Awakens, that there was this agenda of, we're going to stick it to you, white man. We're taking your stuff from you, and we're going to take a crap in it just to spite you because we're petty. And you could tell that was going on all over A Force Awakens. That's why Rey wasn't just a character who happened to be female. She was deliberately made female so that she wouldn't be male, if that makes sense. And she was deliberately made better than any male anywhere in the movies, because radical feminist jihad was going on in Star Wars. Every other character, every male character, had to be a pox. There were no white men unless they were the villains. And there were a couple, and they were the villains, and that was the only place that a white male could conceivably be cast in the new Star Wars. So it was a deliberate insult to the fan base. Although the fan base was kind of notoriously blind and naive, and many of them didn't see it that way yet, although they did as the sequel trilogy progressed and they got more and more, exposed to the blatantness of the agenda. But people like me, who'd kind of already had our eyes open, we could see it clearly, even in The Force Awakens. It didn't necessarily ruin it as a movie, but it certainly didn't help. And the fact that much of the rest of the movie was only mediocre meant that the movie itself was extremely disappointing. Even in relation to the already disappointing prequel trilogies. But at the same time, Jar Jar Abrams did at least manage to kind of get the breezy, action-oriented feel and pacing right. That was probably the best thing he did. And he had kind of like the right combination of seriousness and lightness. Well, not to say that many of his gags weren't pretty dumb, but he kind of had the right tone. I'll give him that. That at least he did have, and that was something that the George Lucas himself had lost in the prequels. So that was an improvement. The Last Jedi, of course, was just a horrible movie. Not only is it just a bad movie in every sense, but it made all of the characters ridiculous. The plot was ridiculous. And this is just a disaster. It was a train wreck in every way. And I don't want to go too much into why. You can go read some of the usual suspects on YouTube videos to kind of see about that. And I mean, guys like Nerdrotic and Geeks and Gamers and Overlord DVD and Critical Drinker and, plenty of others kind of sum that up. I don't need to beat that dead horse. In between those, we had Rogue One, which was a decent movie. It was appropriate to be told as a type of spin-off. It was very clearly made, I think, for a Chinese audience, prominently featuring some Chinese characters as it did. And then just kind of also the way that the plot and resolution of it was told was just not really in an American context of storytelling. It feels very much like a Chinese movie that just wasn't made by the Chinese, but it was clearly made for them. Now, again, that doesn't mean that it was a bad movie for Americans. I think for the most part, Americans enjoyed that movie. I did. I don't think it's great, but I like it, and I think it's probably the best movie that Disney Star Wars did, or maybe even the best thing that Disney Star Wars did. But yeah, The Last Jedi kind of ruined it. And The Last Jedi also, it's worth pointing out, took a crap in the market for Star Wars. This was reflected in the next movie that came out, which was another spin-off called Solo, which is notoriously the first Star Wars movie that quote-unquote flopped. That's not really true. There have been other Star Wars materials that was very, very poorly received. The holiday special being the most notorious of those, but there's also the Ewok movies. There's also the Clone Wars theatrical release. There were other Star Wars movies that were not really all that successful, but this one, famously flopped when it was expected not to. It's not because the movie itself is terrible, although it's not, again, not great, and a lot of it's agenda driven. The having to be completely unable to grasp the character traits that make Han Solo who he is, because the writers are such betas and losers that they just couldn't quite get it together, was one of the main things that was not good. And then Lando's ridiculous feminazi droid, which, to be fair, was obviously tongue-in-cheek, but still, it was just like, are you freaking kidding me? And there was other things about that movie that aren't great either, but it's not that bad. So why was it unsuccessful? And I don't think it was because of the merits of that movie. I think it was because of the merits of the previous movie, which was The Last Jedi, which so turned off the Star Wars fan and the audience that they passed on Solo. And in some cases, they actively rebelled against Solo and refused to give it money. This is kind of what happens in series if a movie is not super well received, is it's the next one that suffers. And you saw this with Mission Impossible, the Mission Impossible series, for example, and you saw it with others as well. It's just kind of how it works. Solo was caught up in the flack from The Last Jedi. In and of itself, it wasn't a great movie. It wasn't even a movie that was a great idea to have made, maybe. But it's not that bad, and it didn't deserve to have been, quote-unquote, the first Star Wars flop. Rise of Skywalker, of course, is the last one, and it's a whole big mess. The plot is all over the place. It dangles plot threads and then forgets about them. You get whiplash from stuff that's changing for no reason whatsoever. I mean, it's just such a poorly made movie that it makes the worst of the prequels look like a masterpiece. It's amazing that went out the gate in the state that it did. And it's just shocking that Lucasfilm was so poorly run that happened. So yeah, once again, not a, and the other thing that just is a disaster about the sequel trilogy is that it deliberately undoes everything that the original trilogy accomplished. All those characters, no, you know what, all your victories, we're going to take them back and say, never mind, you didn't really win. Now we've got this new little girl who, with no training, no development, no nothing, is going to show up and do it right because she's the specialist princess ever. And you guys are just men, so what do you know? It was just freaking insulting that they did that. And not only that, all of you original characters, we're going to also say that almost immediately after Return of the Jedi, your life went to crap. You became super big losers who made stupid decisions that make no sense and ruined your life and sat around wallowing in self-pity for decades. The idea that they could do this to Star Wars is just infuriating. That said, so I don't really consider Disney Star Wars as anything other than pretty badly written fan fiction by people who don't get Star Wars and in fact don't like Star Wars and are trying to make it into something that it isn't and it never was. And I think that that's fair. I know that I'm not the person who determines what is and isn't Star Wars canon, but from my perspective, I would maybe cherry pick a handful of elements out of the Disney Star Wars movies, but mostly I would completely ignore them and think that they're crap. They're just crap. They're terrible. And they don't get Star Wars at all. They break Star Wars. They don't take it in new, interesting directions. They just break it and then laugh at the fans because they broke something that you liked. But there are some cool ideas in there here and there. I actually think the idea of Palpatine coming back isn't necessarily a terrible idea, although the way it was done, where it kind of deliberately said, haha, Luke and the rest of you guys, you failed, was just super botched execution. But the idea of somehow saying he was able to come back and there was this whole Sith cult on this planet, Exegol, that's actually not a bad idea. Some of the other individual locations are really pretty cool. Some of the visual design is really pretty cool. But there's no characters that I like, really, and nothing much about the plot that I like, really. I think it's a little bit funny that it seems like every other planet in the Star Wars universe is basically another rehash of Dune. It's another, sandy desert planet. I mean, how many of those do we have now? We have three of them just in the sequel trilogy. In the Disney Star Wars alone. Not to mention, Tatooine showed up in literally every Star Wars movie prior to that, except The Empire Strikes Back. And, frankly, Geonosis is basically the same thing too, with bugs on it and a little bit more red instead of tan. So it's a little ridiculous. Why are there so many desert planets? I mean, sure, it's a cool environment, but do we really need more and more and more of them? So not everything that they came up with is good. Very little of it, but there are some elements that I would cherry pick out there. I think the Sith stuff is probably the top of that list. The Sith cult and the whole planet of Exegol and this whole secret, Sith headquarters with this bizarre cultists and stuff going on back there. That's actually the best idea out of all of Disney Star Wars, out of the whole shebang. Very briefly going to talk about The Mandalorian. Mandalorian, of course, is much more popular, mostly because it has better storytelling and better, more likable characters. But I will say that it's not that great either. Honestly, The Mandalorian has very, very safe stories, very, very safe plotting. It's to the point of being borderline boring, and it really makes a hash out of continuity and established lore, which, maybe again doesn't matter except to big Star Wars fans, but it's it's kind of like, what the devil is going on here. What do you mean they don't take their helmets off? They took their helmets off all the time in previous shows like Rebels and Clone Wars, et cetera, et cetera. There's just, over and over again, they just kind of deliberately make a hash out of it. And I'm surprised that Star Wars fans don't give the show a little bit more grief for that, because it's really kind of, why did you do that? Why would you do that? And, why would we accept it? I think part of it because Star Wars fans are in the age of Disney, excuse me, kind of like battered women. And, any sign of anything that's even mediocre, we're happy to take it, because what we usually get is such absolute crap. So anyway, I will I think I'll wrap it up here. This is already, I think, the longest of the videos I've made so far, and I didn't really get into a lot of details. I kind of referred you to other people who have already done it better. But needless to say, I'm not really a fan of anything that Disney Star Wars made, although I do think that there are little details here and there that are salvageable. But overall, the whole thing just kind of really needs to go. Anyway, I think next time I'm going to talk about one of the only things from old Star Wars continuity that is still running, which is the Old Republic. And I think I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail next time we come around.